After losing her father in a tragic accident, 12-year-old Emily is sent to live with distant relatives who barely know her. She receives an unexpected gift on her birthday, a mysterious locket from her late father, containing a photograph of him with an unknown woman. The morning was cold and foggy, with a thick mist covering the streets of the small town. The sound of an approaching car was muffled by the fog, but still unsettlingly present. Emily, a 10-year-old girl, sat in the back seat, her large, sad eyes fixed on the window, trying to absorb what was left of her old life. She clutched a small rag doll, the only link she had to the home she had just lost. Less than a week before, Emily's life had been shattered. Her father, her hero, had been the victim of a terrible car accident. The news had come as a crushing shock, a wave of pain so intense it seemed impossible to bear. Her mother, already sick and emotionally distant, couldn't handle the loss and, unable to care for her daughter, made the difficult decision to send Emily to live with distant relatives. As the car wound its way down the curvy road, Emily felt the weight of isolation growing in her chest. She was being taken to the home of an aunt and uncle she barely knew. People who, until that moment, were just names and vague faces in old photographs. The little she knew about them came from the rare conversations her parents had about that side of the family with whom they didn't keep in touch. When the car finally stopped in front of an old red brick house, Emily's sense of helplessness deepened. The house looked austere and unwelcoming, with its closed windows and dark curtains. The front door opened slowly, revealing a middle-aged woman, her Aunt Margaret, who observed the scene with a serious, somewhat disinterested expression. "So, you must be Emily," Margaret said, her voice as cold as the wind blowing. Emily just nodded, unable to find words to respond. Beside Margaret was Uncle Arthur, a sturdy man with a stern look who mumbled a brief, unenthusiastic welcome. The inside of the house was as gloomy as it seemed from the outside. The furniture was old, and the walls were a dull shade of gray that seemed to absorb all the light. Margaret led Emily to a small room upstairs. It was simple, with an iron bed and an old wardrobe that creaked when opened. "This will be your room," Margaret said curtly. "I hope you're grateful for it." Emily just looked around, feeling more alone than ever. With nothing more to say, Margaret left, leaving Emily in her new and desolate home. She sat on the bed and hugged her rag doll, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. From that moment on, Emily's life became a routine of isolation and silence. Margaret and Arthur were distant figures, offering only the bare necessities for her survival. There was no affection, no comfort. Emily spent most of her time in her room, lost in thoughts and memories of a time that now seemed to belong to another life. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks dragged on like months. Emily went to school, but she had no friends. The other children saw her as a stranger, an intruder who didn't belong there. And she felt it. She felt invisible, as if her existence didn't matter to anyone. The world around her seemed to have closed off, leaving her trapped in a bubble of loneliness and pain. Despite the overwhelming sadness, there was a small flicker of hope in Emily's heart. Something told her that her father hadn't completely abandoned her, that somehow, somewhere, he was still watching over her. This hope, however small, was what kept her going, day after day. And it was this same hope that made Emily, even in her darkest moments, refuse to give up. Because, despite everything, she still believed that the world had something more to offer. Something that, one day, somehow, would come to her. And that belief was what kept her alive, even when everything she knew had crumbled around her. 2 years had passed since Emily had been sent to live with her Aunt Margaret and Uncle Arthur. She was now 12, and the once unbearable ache of losing her father had dulled into a persistent, hollow emptiness. Life at her relative's home remained cold and routine. There was no warmth, no affection, and certainly no one to confide in. Emily had learned to keep her head down, to avoid drawing attention to herself, and to retreat into her own world of books and memories. Her 12th birthday arrived on a gray, rainy day. The house was as gloomy as ever, the clouds outside casting long shadows on the faded wallpaper. There was no mention of her birthday at breakfast, no acknowledgement from her aunt or uncle. Emily had not expected anything different, but the silence still weighed heavily on her heart. After school, she returned home to find the house unusually quiet. Margaret was in the kitchen, but there was no dinner being prepared. Arthur was nowhere to be seen. As Emily climbed the creaky stairs to her small room, she noticed an unfamiliar object on her bed. A small, square package wrapped in plain brown paper. Her heart skipped a beat. There was no note, no indication of who it was from. She cautiously approached the bed, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the package. It was surprisingly light. Emily carefully unwrapped the brown paper, revealing a small, intricately designed wooden box. It looked old, with delicate carvings of flowers and vines on its surface. Her breath caught as she opened the box to find an antique locket nestled inside. The locket was beautiful, crafted from polished silver, with an elegant, swirling design etched into its surface. Emily stared at it, mesmerized. With trembling hands, she opened the locket. Inside, there was a small photograph. The image was faded, but she could make out the faces of two people, a man and a woman. The man was unmistakably her father, younger and full of life, smiling warmly at the camera. But the woman beside him was a mystery. She was beautiful, with kind eyes and dark hair, but Emily had never seen her before. Questions flooded Emily's mind. Who was this woman? Why was her father with her? And more importantly, who had sent her this locket? She turned the locket over, hoping for some inscription or clue, but there was nothing. Emily clutched the locket to her chest, feeling a mix of emotions: confusion, curiosity, and a deep longing to understand. Her father had always been a man of secrets, a man who kept certain parts of his life hidden, even from her. But why would he have left this locket, and why now? For the rest of the evening, Emily couldn't focus on anything else. She kept the locket close, touching it every now and then as if to reassure herself that it was real. At dinner, she wanted to ask Margaret and Arthur if they knew anything about it, but the icy atmosphere at the table discouraged her from speaking up. They never noticed her quiet distractions, absorbed in their own lives as usual. That night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling with the locket clutched in her hand. She couldn't shake the feeling that this gift, this mysterious locket, was important. It felt like a message from her father, a piece of a puzzle that she needed to solve. But where to begin? The photograph haunted her thoughts. The woman's face seemed familiar in a way that Emily couldn't explain. Had she seen her before? In an old photo album, perhaps? The questions kept swirling in her mind, making it impossible to sleep. As the hours passed, Emily made a decision. She couldn't ignore this gift, this connection to her father. She would find out who the woman in the photograph was, and why her father had kept this locket all these years. It was a mission, a purpose that gave her a glimmer of hope in the otherwise bleak reality of her life. The next morning, Emily woke up with a renewed sense of determination. She would start by asking her aunt, carefully and without revealing too much. Margaret might know something, even if she chose not to share it. But Emily was prepared to dig deeper, to do whatever it took to uncover the truth behind the mysterious gift. With the locket tucked safely under her shirt, Emily set out on what she knew would be a long and challenging journey. But for the first time in years, she felt a spark of excitement. She wasn't just a lonely, forgotten child anymore. She was a girl with a secret, and that secret would lead her to something, or someone, who could change her life forever. Emily's days took on a new sense of urgency as she quietly investigated the locket. Each morning, she would carefully open it, staring at the photograph of her father and the mysterious woman, hoping to recognize some hidden detail that might offer a clue. The more she studied the photo, the more certain she became that this woman was connected to her father's past in a significant way. But every time she tried to approach her Aunt Margaret for answers, the icy wall of indifference blocked her path. Margaret was a woman of few words, and even fewer displays of affection. Emily's tentative questions about her father or his past were often met with curt responses or deflections. The older woman seemed uninterested in discussing the man who had once been her brother, and even less interested in entertaining Emily's curiosity. This only fueled Emily's determination to find answers on her own. One weekend, when Margaret and Arthur were out, Emily decided to search the attic. It was a dark, dusty place that neither of her relatives visited often. She hoped that among the forgotten boxes and old furniture, there might be something that could point her in the right direction. After hours of sifting through cobwebs and old belongings, she finally found what she was looking for: an old photo album buried deep under a pile of blankets. With trembling hands, Emily opened the album and flipped through the pages. There were pictures of her father as a young man, smiling and full of life, but nothing that included the woman from the locket. Just as she was about to give up, she turned a page and there it was, a photo of her father and the same woman, this time in front of a small, picturesque house. They looked happy, almost as if they belonged together. But there was no name, no date, nothing to indicate where or when the photo had been taken. Her heart raced as she scanned the background, trying to identify any landmark or sign that could help her find the location. Then she saw it, just barely visible in the corner of the photo, a street sign with the name Oakview. It wasn't much, but it was something. Emily took the album back to her room, carefully removing the photo and slipping it into her pocket. That night, she waited until everyone was asleep before sneaking downstairs to use the old family computer. She typed Oakview into the search engine, hoping to find a connection to the house in the photo. Several results popped up, but one in particular caught her attention. Oakview was a small town just a few hours' drive away. The realization sent a thrill through her. This was the break she needed. If she could get to Oakview, she might be able to find the house, and maybe even the woman in the photo. But how would she get there? Aunt Margaret and Uncle Arthur certainly wouldn't take her, and she had no money of her own for a bus ticket. The next few days were spent in careful planning. Emily was used to being invisible in her own home, and she used this to her advantage. She began quietly saving her school lunch money, skipping meals when she could, and hiding the small bills in a shoebox under her bed. It wasn't much, but after a week, she had enough for a one-way ticket to Oakview. On a Saturday morning, when Margaret and Arthur were out running errands, Emily put her plan into action. She packed a small bag with a change of clothes, the shoebox with her saved money, and the locket safely tucked around her neck. She left a brief note on her bed, explaining she had gone to visit a friend, a lie she hoped would buy her enough time. The bus ride was long and filled with anxiety. Every bump in the road, every stop made her heart pound with fear that she might be caught. But as the bus finally pulled into Oakview, her fear gave way to a nervous excitement. She was here. She was really doing this. Oakview was a small, quiet town surrounded by trees and filled with charming, old-fashioned houses. Emily could feel the history in the air as she walked down the main street, clutching the photo tightly in her hand. She didn't know where to start, but she knew she couldn't give up now. She showed the photograph to a few locals, asking if they recognized the house or the woman. Most shook their heads, but one elderly man at a local cafe looked closely at the photo, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "I think I know that house," he said slowly. "It's on the edge of town, near the woods. Belongs to a woman named Sarah. She's lived there for years, quiet type. Don't see her much these days, but everyone knows her. Real nice lady." Emily's heart raced as she thanked the man and hurried in the direction he pointed. The sun was beginning to set as she reached the outskirts of Oakview. The houses became fewer and farther between, and soon she found herself on a narrow, winding road leading into the woods. There, almost hidden among the trees, was the house from the photograph. It was even more beautiful in person, though it had aged since the photo was taken. The white paint was peeling in places, and the garden was overgrown, but it was unmistakably the same house. Emily stood in front of it, feeling a wave of emotions: fear, excitement, hope. She hesitated for a moment, then gathered her courage and walked up to the front door. Her hand shook as she knocked. For a few moments, there was no sound, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. Emily was about to turn away, convinced she had made a mistake, when the door slowly opened. A woman stood in the doorway, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes just as kind as they were in the photograph. She stared at Emily for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke. "You must be Emily." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "How do you know my name?" The woman smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I knew your father. He spoke of you often." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. She had found her, the woman from the photograph, the woman who knew her father. And now, standing on the threshold of this old house, she felt that the answers she had been searching for were finally within reach. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the woman who had just spoken her name. Sarah, the woman from the photograph, the mysterious figure who seemed to hold the key to her father's past, was real. And now, Emily was standing in front of her, a mixture of fear and hope swirling inside her. "Come in, Emily," Sarah said gently, stepping aside to let her enter. Her voice was soft, yet it carried an unspoken warmth that immediately made Emily feel at ease. As Emily stepped inside, she couldn't help but notice how different the house felt compared to her aunt and uncle's cold, austere home. The interior of Sarah's house was cozy, filled with the scent of old wood and something sweet, like freshly baked bread. The furniture was a mix of vintage pieces and comfortable cushions, with artwork covering the walls, paintings of landscapes, flowers, and distant places. It was clear that this house had been a home filled with life, love, and creativity. "Would you like something to drink? Tea, maybe?" Sarah asked as she led Emily into a small, sunlit kitchen. "Yes, please," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She sat at the kitchen table, her eyes wandering over the room, trying to take in every detail. It felt surreal to be here, as if she had stepped into another world. Sarah moved about the kitchen with ease, preparing tea and setting out a plate of biscuits. As she worked, Emily noticed a slight tremor in her hands, a sign of age, or perhaps a reflection of the emotion this unexpected visit stirred in her. Finally, Sarah joined her at the table, placing a steaming cup of tea in front of Emily. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice still trembling with nerves. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, drawing comfort from the heat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence hanging between them heavy with unasked questions. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "You must have a lot of questions," she said, her eyes meeting Emily's with a gentle but direct gaze. Emily nodded. I found this locket," she began, reaching under her shirt to pull out the locket that had started this journey. "It was a gift, but I don't know who sent it. I saw your picture inside, with my father. I came here to find out who you are, and who my father was." Sarah looked at the locket with a mix of recognition and sorrow. "That locket was meant for me," she said quietly, "but it seems that life had other plans." She sighed deeply, as if trying to gather her thoughts, then began to speak. "Your father and I, we were close, a long time ago. We met when we were both very young. I was just starting out as an artist, trying to find my place in the world. He was full of dreams, full of ideas, and he swept me off my feet. We were engaged, planning a future together. But things changed." Sarah paused, her eyes distant as she remembered those days. Emily listened intently, her heart aching with the weight of each word. "Your father was a wonderful man, but he had his secrets, his fears. He came from a troubled background, one that haunted him even as he tried to build a new life. And then, he met your mother. They fell in love, and I knew, deep down, that our time had come to an end. It was painful, but I let him go because I wanted him to be happy." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she imagined her father, torn between two loves, and the woman sitting across from her who had loved him enough to let him go. "After they married, we lost touch," Sarah continued, her voice tinged with regret. "I stayed here, in Oakview, and he moved on with his life. I never stopped thinking about him, wondering how he was, if he was happy. And then one day, I received a letter. It was from him, after all those years." Sarah reached into a drawer and pulled out a faded envelope, its edges worn with time. "He wrote to me, saying he had something important to tell me, something he needed to set right. He mentioned the locket, said it was something he had kept all those years. But before he could send it to me, before we could meet again, the accident happened." A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek as she looked at Emily. "When I heard about the accident, I was devastated. I thought I'd lost him forever, without ever getting to say goodbye. And now, here you are, his daughter. The part of him I never knew." Emily's heart ached for Sarah, for the love she had lost, And for the father, she now realized she barely knew. "I'm so sorry," Emily whispered, feeling the weight of Sarah's pain. Sarah reached across the table and gently took Emily's hand. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Emily. Your father loved you more than anything. He wanted to be there for you. But life doesn't always go as we plan." For the next few hours, Sarah and Emily talked. Sarah shared stories about her time with Emily's father, painting a picture of the man he had been before tragedy and responsibility had weighed him down. Emily, in turn, shared her own memories, the few she had, of a father who had seemed distant yet loving in his own way. As the evening wore on, Sarah offered Emily a place to stay, at least for a while. Emily hesitated at first, thinking about Margaret and Arthur and how they might react. But the thought of returning to that cold, unwelcoming house made her decision easier. "I'd like that," Emily finally said, a small smile forming on her lips. The days that followed were like nothing Emily had ever experienced. Sarah's house, once a place filled with memories of the past, began to fill with new life. The two of them fell into an easy routine, Sarah working on her art while Emily explored the town or helped around the house. In the evenings, they would talk, often late into the night, sharing stories and slowly bridging the gap between their two worlds. Sarah introduced Emily to the world of art, teaching her how to paint, how to express her feelings through colors and shapes. It was a new and exciting experience for Emily, who had never been encouraged to explore her creative side. Under Sarah's guidance, she began to find a voice she never knew she had. As weeks turned into months, Emily felt herself changing. The sadness that had once consumed her began to lift, replaced by a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since before her father's death. Sarah became more than just a connection to her father's past. She became a mentor, a friend, and in many ways, the mother figure Emily had been missing. For Sarah, having Emily around was like a second chance at the life she had once dreamed of. She found joy in teaching Emily, in watching her grow and discover herself. And with each passing day, the bond between them grew stronger, as if they were two pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. But as happy as Emily was, a lingering question remained in the back of her mind. A question that she knew she would eventually have to ask. Why had her father wanted to reconnect with Sarah after all those years? What was it that he needed to set right? The answer, Emily suspected, would change everything. The summer months drifted by, bringing warmth and color to Oakview. Emily and Sarah had settled into a comfortable routine, their days filled with art, conversation, and quiet moments in the garden. Emily was happier than she had been in years, but as the days grew longer, so did the questions in her mind. She knew she needed to learn more about her father's past and his connection to Sarah. One evening, after a particularly long day of painting, Emily and Sarah sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the kind of scene that begged to be captured on canvas. But tonight, Emily's thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the unanswered questions that had been gnawing at her. "Sarah," Emily began hesitantly, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Sarah turned to her, her expression calm and understanding. "Go ahead, Emily. You can ask me anything." Emily took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Why did my father want to reconnect with you? After all those years, what was it that he needed to set right?" Sarah's eyes softened with a sadness that Emily had come to recognize. She sighed and looked out at the horizon, as if searching for the strength to answer. "It's a complicated story, Emily. One that I haven't told anyone in a very long time." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, sensing the gravity of what Sarah was about to reveal. She waited patiently, knowing that whatever Sarah had to say would be difficult. Sarah began slowly, her voice tinged with emotion. "As I told you before, your father and I were engaged when we were young. We were in love, or at least, we thought we were. But as time went on, it became clear that we were different people, with different dreams. Your father wanted stability, a family, while I was more focused on my art, on finding myself." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "We drifted apart, and when he met your mother, I knew that he had found what he was looking for. I was happy for him, truly, but there was something I never told him, something that I kept to myself because I didn't want to burden him." Emily leaned in closer, her eyes wide with anticipation. What was it? Sarah looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the porch railing. I was pregnant, Emily, with your father's child. The revelation hit Emily like a thunderbolt. She gasped, her mind racing to comprehend what Sarah had just said. But what happened? Where is the child? Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she continued. I lost the baby. It was early on, and by the time I knew, it was too late. I never told your father because I didn't want to pull him back into my life. Not when he was already building a new one with your mother. It was the hardest decision I ever made, but I thought it was for the best. Emily felt a deep sadness for Sarah, for the pain she had carried all these years. Did my father ever find out? Sarah shook her head. No, not until much later. Years after you were born, I ran into him by chance. We talked briefly, and I could tell he was still haunted by the past, by the choices we had made. I never mentioned the baby, but something in his eyes told me he knew there was more to our story. She paused, her voice trembling. A few months before the accident, I received a letter from him. He said he had learned the truth about our lost child. He didn't say how, but he wanted to meet, to talk, to finally put the past to rest. He wrote that he was sorry, that he wished he had known sooner, that he wanted to make amends. Emily's heart ached as she imagined her father, burdened by guilt and regret, reaching out to Sarah in the hopes of making things right. But he never got the chance, Emily whispered, the weight of it all sinking in. No, Sarah replied, tears slipping down her cheeks. He never did. The accident took him before we could meet. But the locket, that was his way of trying to reconnect, to acknowledge what we had lost. Emily felt her own tears welling up. The locket that she had cherished, that had been a symbol of mystery and connection, was now revealed as a token of her father's deepest regrets. It was a link to a part of his life she had never known, a life filled with love, loss, and unspoken sorrow. I'm so sorry, Sarah, Emily said, her voice choked with emotion. I didn't know. I didn't realize how much you had been through. Sarah reached out and took Emily's hand, squeezing it gently. It's not your fault, Emily. None of it is. But now that you're here, maybe we can both find some peace in knowing the truth. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky darken as the sun dipped below the horizon. The bond between them, forged through shared loss and the desire to understand the past, grew stronger in that quiet moment. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Emily knew that her journey was far from over. She had uncovered a crucial piece of her father's past, but there were still more questions to be answered, more mysteries to unravel. Yet, for the first time, she felt a sense of closure, of understanding. She wasn't alone in her grief anymore. Sarah had been there too, carrying the same weight, the same sorrow. And together, they would honor her father's memory by finding the answers he had sought, by healing the wounds that had remained open for so long. Emily turned to Sarah, her voice filled with determination. We'll figure this out, Sarah. We'll find a way to make peace with the past. Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and sadness. Yes, Emily, we will. And with that, the two of them sat together, ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that they had each other to lean on. The days following Sarah's revelation were filled with a heavy silence. Both Emily and Sarah seemed lost in their thoughts, grappling with the weight of the past. Emily spent more time alone, wandering through Oakview, her mind replaying the story Sarah had shared with her. The knowledge that her father had carried such deep regrets, that he had wanted to make amends before his death, weighed heavily on her heart. One afternoon, as Emily sat by the old oak tree in Sarah's garden, she found herself staring at the locket once again. It felt heavier now, burdened with the truth it represented. She turned it over in her hands, running her fingers over the delicate etchings, as if searching for answers in its cold, metal surface. The image of her father and Sarah, smiling and full of life, was now tinged with a bittersweet sadness. The more Emily thought about it, the more questions surfaced. Why had her father waited so long to reach out to Sarah? And why had he kept so much of his past hidden? She knew she needed to understand more, to piece together the parts of his life that had been kept from her. She needed closure, for both herself and Sarah. That evening, Emily finally gathered the courage to ask Sarah more about her father's letter. They sat together in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. Emily could see the hesitation in Sarah's eyes as she retrieved the letter from a small wooden box on the mantel. Sarah handed the letter to Emily with a trembling hand. "I've read it so many times," Sarah said quietly, trying to understand what he was feeling, what he wanted to say. Emily took the letter carefully, unfolding the worn paper with a mixture of reverence and fear. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, strong and precise. Yet there were signs of hesitation in certain words, as if he had struggled with what to say. The letter began with an apology. Her father expressed his regret for how things had ended between him and Sarah, for the choices he had made, and for the pain he had unknowingly caused. He spoke of the guilt he had carried for years, of how he had tried to bury the past, but had always known it would resurface one day. As Emily read further, she came across a passage that made her heart skip a beat. "I've spent so many years trying to be the man my family needed, to be a good husband and father. But I can't help but think of the life I left behind, of the people I hurt in the process. I've wanted to reach out to you for so long, but I was afraid of what I might find, afraid that I would only reopen old wounds. But I realize now that running from the past hasn't brought me peace. It's time to face it, to seek forgiveness, and to offer it in return." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she continued reading. The letter went on to explain how her father had recently learned the truth about Sarah's pregnancy and how devastated he had been to discover that she had lost their child. He wrote of the sorrow he felt, not just for the child they had lost, but for the life they might have had together, a life that would never be. "I don't know what I was hoping for when I decided to write to you, but I know I need to make amends. I don't expect you to forgive me, Sarah, but I need you to know that I am truly sorry. For everything. I'm sending you this locket. It was always meant for you. I hope it brings you some comfort, as small as it may be." The letter ended with a plea for Sarah to meet him, to talk, to finally put the past to rest. But that meeting had never happened, and now, the locket was in Emily's hands, a symbol of the unresolved pain her father had carried with him to the grave. Emily wiped away her tears, her heart breaking for her father, for Sarah, and for the child who had never been. She looked up at Sarah, who was watching her with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I didn't know he was in so much pain," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't know he was still thinking about you, about the past." Sarah nodded, her own eyes glistening with tears. "He kept it hidden, Emily. From everyone, even from himself, I think. But in the end, he couldn't escape it. None of us can." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the revelations hanging heavily in the air. Emily felt a deep sense of loss, not just for her father, but for the life he might have lived, for the happiness he might have found if things had been different. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking, Emily, about your father, about everything that's happened. I think it's time for us to go to the place where it all began. Maybe it will help us find the closure we need." Emily looked at Sarah, confused. "What do you mean?" "There's a place not far from here," Sarah explained. "It's where your father and I first met, where we spent a lot of time together. I haven't been there in years, but I think it's where we need to go. To say goodbye, in a way." Emily felt a surge of apprehension, but also a sense of resolve. She knew that this was something they both needed to do, to finally lay the past to rest. "Okay," she said, her voice firm despite the emotions swirling inside her. "Let's go." The next morning, Emily and Sarah set out for the place Sarah had spoken of, a secluded spot on the edge of a forest, where a small, crystal-clear lake lay hidden from the world. It was a place of beauty and tranquility, a place that had once been filled with laughter and love. As they walked along the path that led to the lake, Sarah spoke softly, recounting memories of her time with Emily's father, memories that were both joyful and bittersweet. Emily listened intently, absorbing every word, feeling a deeper connection to her father with each step they took. When they reached the lake, Sarah paused, her eyes misty with emotion. "This is where we used to come, whenever we needed to escape, to be alone. It's where we dreamed about the future, before everything changed. Emily gazed out at the water, the surface smooth and reflective like a mirror. She could almost see her father there, a young man full of hope and love, standing beside Sarah as they planned a life that never came to be. Sarah pulled the locket from around Emily's neck and held it out over the water. It was meant for me, but I think it's time to let it go. To let him go. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. Together, they released the locket into the lake, watching as it sank slowly beneath the surface, disappearing into the depths below. It was a final farewell, a way of honoring the love that had been lost, but never forgotten. As they stood there, side by side, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. The past had been painful, full of secrets and regrets, but now it was time to move forward. She and Sarah had found each other, and together, they could build a new future, one that honored the memory of her father while embracing the possibilities that lay ahead. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lake in a golden glow, Emily knew that they had finally found the closure they had been searching for. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led them to a place of understanding, of healing, and most importantly, of love. The days after their visit to the lake were marked by a quiet but palpable sense of peace. Emily and Sarah continued to live together, their bond strengthened by the journey they had taken and the secrets they had uncovered. Yet, despite the calm that had settled over them, there was still a lingering question in Emily's mind, one that had been growing ever since she first arrived at Sarah's house. Why had Sarah taken her in so readily? Why, after all these years, had Sarah chosen to welcome her, a stranger, into her home and her life? It was a question that Emily couldn't shake, even as the days passed in relative calm. She knew that Sarah's connection to her father played a role, but there was something more, something deeper that Emily sensed but couldn't quite grasp. And so, one evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Emily decided it was time to ask. "Sarah," Emily began softly, her voice almost lost in the hum of the evening, "can I ask you something?" Sarah turned to her, smiling warmly. "Of course, Emily. What's on your mind?" Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Why did you take me in? I mean, when I showed up here, you didn't know me. You had every reason to send me away, but you didn't. Why?" Sarah's smile faded slightly as she considered the question, her gaze drifting out to the garden. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the sounds of the night, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice tinged with a sadness that Emily had come to recognize. "When I first saw you standing on my doorstep, you reminded me of someone I used to know very well," Sarah said, her eyes reflecting memories that Emily could only guess at. Someone who was lost, alone, and in need of someone to care for them. That someone was me. Emily's heart tightened at the confession. She hadn't expected this, hadn't realized just how deeply Sarah's own past was tied to her decision to take her in. "When I was your age," Sarah continued, "I was a lot like you, confused, hurt, and unsure of where I belonged. My parents were distant, more concerned with their own lives than with raising a daughter. Art was my only escape, my way of coping with a world that often felt cold and indifferent. I grew up feeling like I didn't matter, like I was invisible." Sarah paused, her voice softening as she looked at Emily. "But then I met your father, and for the first time, I felt like someone truly saw me, cared about me. He was my anchor, my safe place. Losing him, it was like losing a part of myself. And when you showed up at my door, I saw that same pain in your eyes, that same loneliness." Emily listened, her eyes wide with understanding. She had never considered that Sarah's actions might have been driven by her own experiences, by the echoes of her own childhood pain. "I didn't want you to go through what I did," Sarah continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't want you to feel like you didn't matter, like you had no one. When I saw you, I knew I couldn't turn you away. I wanted to be the person for you that I wish someone had been for me." Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes. Sarah's words touched something deep inside her, a place that had long been filled with loneliness and doubt. She had spent so much time wondering why Sarah had taken her in, never realizing that the answer was rooted in a shared pain, a shared desire to protect and heal. "You've been more than that, Sarah," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've been everything I needed and more. I don't know where I'd be without you." Sarah reached out and took Emily's hand, squeezing it gently. "And you've been a blessing to me, Emily. You've given me a chance to make up for the mistakes of the past, to give back some of the love that I never had the chance to give before. In many ways, you've saved me too." They sat in silence for a while, the connection between them growing even stronger as they held hands, sharing in the comfort of each other's presence. For the first time in her life, Emily felt truly seen, truly understood, and she knew that Sarah felt the same. As the evening deepened into night, Sarah spoke again, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "Emily, I want you to know that this is your home now. You don't have to worry about going back to your aunt and uncles. You belong here with me." Emily's heart swelled with gratitude and relief. She had been so afraid of being sent back, of losing the one place where she had finally found a sense of belonging. But now, hearing Sarah's words, she knew that she was safe, that she had found a true home. "Thank you, Sarah," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for everything." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "No, Emily. Thank you." And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Emily and Sarah sat together, their hearts full of love and gratitude. They had both been lost, both been hurt, but together, they had found a way to heal, to create a new family out of the ashes of the past. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt at peace. She had found her place, her purpose, and most importantly, she had found someone who truly cared for her. The journey had been long and painful, but it had led her to where she was meant to be, right here, beside Sarah, in the home they had made together. As the first chill of autumn settled over Oakview, Emily found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her here. The summer had been transformative, a time of discovery, healing, and new beginnings. She had come to Sarah's doorstep seeking answers, but she had found so much more: a home, a family, and a deeper understanding of herself and her father.